This case was very challenging. A lot of people believe that if you can't find the body, then you don't have a case. But that's not true.
When a blood-stained car turns up at the Tampa International Airport, detectives are stumped.
At first, the agents didn't know who the victim was, or who the perpetrator could be, or exactly what crime had been committed.
But when investigators dig more deeply into the evidence, what they find is a tangled web of mystery, deceit, and greed. Tampa, Florida. 100,000 people travel through its bustling airport every day. But on one spring morning, the patterns of daily life are about to change. For Manny Pondakos, it's a much-needed day off. But on his way to catch a flight out of town, he notices something strange.
I had just parked my car in long-term parking, and I was walking toward the main terminal. And as I approached this area here, I noticed a light blue Thunderbird parked right here. And as I looked in the back, I could see this brown substance smeared all over the rear of the headrest.
Manny Pondakos isn't your usual traveler. He's also a special agent of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So his well-trained eye knows immediately something isn't right.
As I got closer to the car, I walked over toward the passenger side and looked in through the passenger's window. And when I looked down at the front seat, I could see that the entire area was covered with that same substance.
Agent Pondakos knows exactly what he's looking at. Dried blood.
I've seen enough crime scenes in my career to know that a certain level of violence took place inside that vehicle. And I also knew that when the crime lab completed their examination, they would confirm that that's exactly what happened.
An act of violence in a car parked at an airport. But who is the victim? FDLE agent Ray Velboom is the lead investigator on the case. He's not surprised when the lab results come in.
Well, the lab analysis showed us that the blood was, in fact, human blood, type A, and then we were able to, just by looking at it, think that probably nobody survived that amount of loss of blood.
Without a body to work with, police turn to the only clue they have, the Ford Thunderbird parked at the Tampa airport.
The airport police had already taken the tag number and run the tag number through the computer and identified who the registered owner of that car was. So it was registered to Bob Grantham.
Bob Grantham is a 52-year-old contractor from Winter Haven, Florida. But when investigators attempt to locate him, what they find seems to confirm their fears.
Robert Grantham had been reported missing by his former wife, Jacqueline O'Hara, 5 days earlier when he had taken a trip to Las Vegas and did not return.
Investigators talked to Grantham's ex-wife about the missing man's lifestyle.
What we were able to determine is that Bob Grantham was a fun-loving guy. He loved to play golf, loved his dogs. I called Jacqueline O'Hara from Las Vegas and said that he had won a lot of money and was having a great time, winning lots of money. And then when he got back into town, he'd come by the next day and pick up his dogs.
But O'Hara, his ex-wife, also reveals another side of Bob Grantham, something that could turn the case upside down.
Jacqueline told us there'd been some history there that Mr. Grantham had run away before, faked his death. She'd gotten phone calls from somebody saying that he'd been murdered before. So she wasn't really sure what he was doing. Was this in fact a murder? Did Bob Grantham fake his own death and disappear and go somewhere else?
His ex-wife also tells investigators that Grantham had been connected with drug dealers in his past. Was his disappearance somehow connected to that? Police decide they need a different kind of investigator, someone who might be able to tell them if they should be looking for a person on the run or a body.
Profilers usually come to a consultation with the detectives and look at an entire array of information, but in a case where the body has not been found, this represents an entirely different challenge for us.
For criminal profiler Dale Hinman, Bob Grantham doesn't sound like a man who needed to fake his own death.
His business was going very well. He had a lot of friends that he played golf with regularly. He had dogs that he cared for quite a bit. Based on what we were seeing, this just didn't sound like a man who would try to fake his own death. It looked like a homicide.
Though his body hasn't been found, police may be able to determine how he was killed by examining the trace evidence. Agent Hinman meets with blood spatter expert John Wierzbowski to recreate the crime scene. She believes Grantham was murdered in his car by a gunshot, but she wants to know if the evidence reveals anything else.
What I've set up for you is a demonstration to produce some high-velocity impact spatter, which is consistent with the type of blood spatter you see in gunshot wounds.
We did notice a lot of blood spatter forward of the victim towards the front of the car, as well as on the headrest behind the victim.
This should do a pretty good job of simulating what you saw. Where we're going to produce the blood spatter is I'm going to take an acrylic sponge, soak it in simulated blood, placing that clamped onto the center support and firing a projectile through it. Okay, I'm ready to take a shot.
Let's have a look.
What we have here. Now, what you see here is very characteristic of a high-velocity impact stain pattern. We have numerous small spots of blood distributed in a random pattern, and the predominant spot size is definitely less than 1 millimeter in diameter.
This is exactly the type of spatter that we observed in the victim's vehicle, forward of where he would have been sitting in the driver's side of the vehicle. Very tiny blood drops, as well as some slightly larger ones.
If you find that type of pattern inside the vehicle, that would definitely be consistent with a gunshot wound as opposed to some kind of blunt trauma or beating death.
They are now sure that Bob Grantham was shot to death. But for a blood spatter investigator, the blood he doesn't see is just as important as the blood he does see.
One of the questions we're asked frequently is, was someone present at the scene of a certain crime? One way that you can do this is looking for void patterns in the blood spatter.
A void pattern is an empty space where blood should have been. If something, or someone, was in the car when Grantham was shot, the space they occupied would be clear of blood spatter.
We have that piece of paper that we put up to illustrate that pattern. It was at one time complete, like this. And watch when I take it away, you see how it's very obvious there was something there, and even somewhat of the shape.
And this is exactly how it looked in the victim's vehicle when we saw the crime scene pictures.
That's correct.
The pattern of the blood spatter allows them to connect another piece of the puzzle.
You can imagine that you're the victim of a gunshot wound to the head, something that's going to cause some high-velocity impact spatter. I'm seated here in this space. There's going to be a high-velocity spatter pattern, maybe even on me, around me, all around you, depending on the locations of the entry and exit wounds. But then when I move, there's the void you might expect to see.
So what we can tell from this experiment is when Mr. Grantham was shot, that somebody else was sitting on the passenger seat.
That's correct.
Whoever was in the front seat with Grantham either killed him or saw the person who did. In any investigation, the place to start is always with the people close to the victim. Digging into Grantham's life, Agent Velboom soon discovers that Grantham had recently started dating a woman named Connie Beasley.
We wanted to talk to Beasley, so we drove out to the dealership here where she worked.
Velboom asks Beasley about her last contact with Bob Grantham.
Told us she hadn't seen Grantham in several days, but did receive a phone call from him while he was in Las Vegas, and he told her he was looking forward to seeing her when he got home.
Investigators look into Connie's background and find no reason to doubt her story. As the search for a suspect continues, a startling new lead arises.
During the very thorough background investigation that was conducted by the agents, it was discovered that Robin Boney, the victim's niece, had been living at his house, and they had been very close, but they had had a recent falling out.
Just a few months earlier, Grantham had caught Robin Boney forging his checks and had her arrested.
Robin had moved out after being arrested from Mr. Grantham's residence, and Robin kept postponing the hearings, and Mr. Grantham was supposed to testify, but never did.
Could Robin Boney have killed Grantham to prevent him from testifying against her?
Money is a very common motivation in a lot of homicide cases, and since we all thought that the killer knew Bob Grantham, Robin Boney had to be considered as a suspect in this case.
Up next, could Grantham's niece be the killer? When investigators discovered that Robin Boney's uncle, Bob Grantham, turned her in for forging his checks, they think they might have a motive for murder.
Robin Boney needed to be considered as a suspect because Bob Grantham was expected to testify against her at her upcoming hearing.
But Hinman isn't convinced Robin Boney is capable of murder.
When the agents looked farther into Robin Boney's criminal past, they realized that all of her crimes involved crimes against property, and this was a violent homicide investigation, so this moved her farther down on our list of suspects.
And Robin Boney is removed from the list altogether when her alibi checks out. The investigation is back to square one.
We're going, well, where else can we go? What can we do with this case? We don't have any evidence. We don't have a body. You know, we've got that hurdle to get over, that there's no body. We've got a crime scene consistent of a Ford Thunderbird with a bunch of stuff in it. That's our total crime scene.
In the search for answers, Agent Hinman heads to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to learn everything she can about Bob Grantham's last movements. She meets with agents Ray Velboom and his partner Steve Davenport to construct the timeline.
Good to see you too.
Hinman's attention is caught by a name, Rudy Benton, a friend of Bob Grantham's and the last person to speak with him before he disappeared.
Benton said that Grantham called him from the Orlando airport and that he wanted to arrange to play golf the next day.
Did he tell the friend that he had won any money while he was in Las Vegas?
Yes, he told him that he had won approximately $3,000.
Well, that may be a possible motivation for his murder if he's telling people that he's won a lot of money, and very often money is a motivating factor in a homicide case.
Had left.
Grantham's phone call to his friend also helps to refine the timeline.
So we know the victim's vehicle arrived at the airport in Tampa sometime in the early morning hours of May 8th, but you have a documented telephone call from the airport in Orlando sometime around 9:30. So the window of opportunity for the commission of this crime is really between 9:30 and sometime around midnight.
The killer had about 3 hours to kill Grantham, dispose of his body, and dump his car at the Tampa airport. But that raises another question.
We starts in Orlando, then we find a car in Tampa. I mean, why do you think there was all that travel? And
Do you think it was somebody that he knew or a complete stranger?
It makes more sense that he knew the individual who shot him, because if it was an absolute stranger, then it would be more likely that the victim's vehicle and the victim would be found at another location. I think that the movement of the vehicle has something to do with delaying the identification that a crime has occurred and what exactly has taken place.
Hinman thinks the killer is someone Grantham knew, someone who feared they might become a suspect and wanted time to distance themselves from the crime. To identify that person, she turns once again to Grantham's last movements.
The last time anyone heard from Bob Grantham was when he made the telephone call to his friend from the airport in Orlando. So it was important to go back and take a closer look at this information.
Searching the phone records, investigators make an interesting discovery.
although Robert Grantham made a phone call to his friend and told him he was at the Orlando airport picking up his luggage, would see him later to play golf, we determined that wasn't true. The phone call came from a Tampa area code.
Investigators believe Grantham lied to his friend because he was trying to keep his relationship with girlfriend Connie Beasley, a woman half his age, a secret. But it doesn't explain why the call came from a Tampa area code registered to a man named Richard Anderson. Who is he, And what is his connection to Bob Grantham?
Once we identified Richard Anderson, we did some surveillance on his residence. We saw a Buick Grand National parked outside of his residence with a sticker from a dealership that turned out to be the same dealership where Connie Beasley worked.
Is it just a coincidence? Investigators don't think so.
Rather than just going and talking to Anderson or confronting him, we decided to keep doing some work and do some surveillance. And it didn't take long. We were able to determine that, in fact, Richard Anderson and Connie Beasley were boyfriend, girlfriend.
Was Connie Beasley cheating on Bob Grantham with Richard Anderson? Investigators begin to suspect that Connie had lured Grantham to her lover's house in order to rob him of his Las Vegas winnings.
Connie Beasley and Richard Anderson were good suspects in this case. They had a clear connection to the victim, and they had a motive. Bob called Connie from Las Vegas, and he probably told her the same thing he told all the other people that he called, is that he was doing well and that he had won a lot of money. Beasley and Anderson certainly could have devised a scheme to kill him and steal the money.
And when investigators run a background check on Richard Anderson, they pull up a long criminal history, including a prior murder conviction where he disposed of the victim's body and left their car at the airport.
Once we had an opportunity to review Anderson's criminal record and to read the case file, we realized how similar these two homicides were, but we needed some proof. We saw Connie Beasley as the weak link in this investigation and that she might be more vulnerable to our investigative efforts.
Coming up next, agents place a wiretap on Anderson's phone. But will it provide the proof investigators are waiting for?
Hello?
They're coming to your place.
What?
Although Bob Grantham's body has never been found, investigators are convinced that Connie Beasley and her lover, Richard Anderson, are responsible for his disappearance.
Not only had Anderson committed a homicide that was strikingly similar to this one, but he had a motive in this case, the money that Grantham had won while he was out in Las Vegas. It probably wasn't very difficult for him to convince Connie Beasley to go along with his plan.
Agents now have one last hope of proving it. With Anderson's apartment under surveillance, they place a wiretap on his phone. Then, they try to scare Connie Beasley into making an incriminating phone call.
When we went to visit Connie at work, we told her everything about Bob Grantham's murder and about Richard Anderson's past. She knew nothing about his previous arrest. She really played it cool, and when we left, we didn't think she'd give us anything.
They stake out Anderson's apartment, waiting for the incriminating call to come through.
We were all sitting in cars outside Anderson's apartment waiting to see what would happen.
Then, suddenly, the wiretap goes active.
Hello? Yeah. What? What are you saying?
I'm just saying they know everything. I don't know everything. They know about your murders before. They've got all the proof. Get out of town, Richard.
All right.
Don't ever come back. Listen to me.
What?
I'm just telling you. They're coming to your place.
Yeah.
Now.
All right, bye.
But as officers move in to arrest him, Anderson makes a desperate bid for freedom.
We see him come down the steps and get in his car and leave. Surveillance is following him. He's driving like a wild man, just very erratic, high speed.
But the chase doesn't last long. Richard Anderson is caught, and he and Connie Beasley are arrested for the murder of Bob Grantham.
Once they were arrested, it wasn't that difficult for agents to talk Connie Beasley into confessing. She admitted that she helped her boyfriend kill Grantham for his money.
She also tells investigators exactly what happened that night.
Connie admitted that she was riding in the front seat with Grantham and Anderson was seated in the back of the vehicle. He reached between the seats and shot Grantham. Then together the two of them dropped the body off in a wooded area and then moved the car to the Tampa airport.
Investigators search for the body for weeks. Although it's never found, Richard Anderson is formally charged with homicide.
Richard Anderson was tried and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death.
In exchange for her cooperation, Connie Beasley is sentenced to 1 year in prison for her part in the plot.
In spite of everything this killer did to throw the agents off the trail, they were still able to work together to solve this very difficult case. And even though the victim's body was never found and the family has no place to go to mourn, Richard Anderson was brought to justice.